Easter Island's moai, the multi-ton statues, some measuring more than 20 meters in length and weighing more than 75 tons, were carved out of the island's quarry of volcanic tuff and then transported, some of them several miles over the island's rugged terrain.
Far out in the Pacific Ocean, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent, lies one of the most isolated places on Earth. For centuries, nearly 1,000 giant stone heads have stood silent on Easter Island, their backs to the sea, staring inland with empty eyes.
We have all these statues, and the faces of the statues do not look like the Easter Islanders. The statues they created, they look like robots.
Theories about how they got there have ranged from ancient aliens to lost technologies, but recent scientific discoveries have revealed the truth, and it paints a darker picture than anyone expected.
Have these very large stone statues on them. Where the idea of creating large stone statues comes from, we can't say for sure if islands developed the idea independently, but the fact that they're all existing together in the same genetic cluster suggested to us that this culture was developed once and spread to all these islands.
The island at the end of the world. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as its inhabitants call it, sits alone in the southeastern Pacific. It's roughly 64 square miles of volcanic rock, shaped like a triangle with an extinct volcano at each corner. The nearest inhabited land is Pitcairn Island, over 1,200 miles away. To put that in perspective, if you stood on the beach and looked out at the horizon, there's nothing but ocean for thousands of miles in every direction. Polynesian voyagers first reached this remote speck of land somewhere between 800 and 1200 AD. They arrived in double-hulled canoes, navigating by stars, waves, and seabirds.
And yet the Polynesians, with no maps and navigating by the stars, had the confidence to sail out and look for a new home and find it.
What they found was a subtropical paradise. The island was covered in dense palm forests, home to numerous bird species. The soil was volcanic and rich. Fresh water flowed from crater lakes. For these settlers, it must have seemed like they'd discovered their own private Eden. The population grew steadily. They brought chickens, rats, and sweet potatoes. They developed their own culture, language, and religion. And at some point, they began carving. Not small statues or decorative pieces, but massive stone figures that would eventually number nearly 900 across the island. These weren't just art. They were moai, representations of deceased ancestors imbued with spiritual power called mana. The bigger the statue, the more mana it held. The stone giants that shouldn't exist. The moai are genuinely impressive. The average statue stands about 13 feet tall and weighs around 14 tons. But many are much larger. The tallest moai ever erected stands 33 feet high. One unfinished statue still in the quarry measures 71 feet long and would have weighed approximately 270 tons if completed. These weren't carved from soft sandstone either. They're made from compressed volcanic ash called tuff, which is relatively workable but still requires serious effort to shape. Nearly all the moai were carved at a single location, the Rano Raraku quarry on the eastern side of the island. Workers used hand tools made from harder basalt rock to slowly chip away at the volcanic tuff. They carved the front and sides first, leaving the back attached to the bedrock. Once the front was complete, they'd undercut the back and use ropes and wooden levers to ease the statue down the slope. Even this part was dangerous. Several moai cracked or broke during extraction and were simply abandoned. But here's what puzzled everyone for generations. These statues didn't stay at the quarry. They were transported across the island, some traveling over 11 miles to their final platforms called ahu. Once there, they were erected upright and topped with massive cylindrical hats called pukao, made from red scoria stone quarried from a different location entirely. Some platforms held a single moai. Others displayed a dozen or more in a row, all facing inland toward the villages they protected. For years, the question hung in the air: how did a society without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, move these multi-ton statues across rough volcanic terrain? Theories multiplied. Some said they used log rollers, others suggested sledges. A few insisted on supernatural intervention or extraterrestrial assistance. The truth, as it turns out, is both simpler and more tragic than anyone imagined. how they actually moved the Moai. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers began conducting practical experiments. They enlisted locals and used traditional materials, testing various methods for moving replica Moai. What they discovered was fascinating. The statues weren't dragged horizontally. They were walked upright, rocking them side to side in a controlled manner, like moving a refrigerator. The Moai's design, with a forward-leaning posture and D-shaped base, made this possible. Teams of 10 to 15 people could move a 10-ton statue using ropes attached to the head and base. They'd pull the ropes rhythmically, tipping the statue slightly onto one edge, then the other, progressing forward in a waddling motion. Oral traditions on the island had always claimed the statues walked to their platforms. Outsiders dismissed this as mythology. Turns out, it was literally accurate. But this method required something critical: space and materials. Specifically, it needed open ground to maneuver and massive amounts of rope. The rope came from fibrous plants that grew abundantly in the island's forests. And the teams needed food, which meant agriculture, which meant cleared land. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Moving Moai became a competition between clans. Bigger statues meant more prestige, more mana, more social standing. As the centuries passed, the statues grew larger and more numerous. Archaeological evidence shows construction accelerated dramatically between 1200 and 1500 AD. During this period, the island's population peaked somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 people. That's a lot of mouths to feed on 64 square miles. The demand for resources intensified. Every new Moai required rope, wood for levers and tools, and labor. Every new person required food, which meant more cleared farmland. The forests that had covered the island when the first settlers arrived began to shrink, and with them, the foundation of Rapa Nui society started to crumble. The palm trees that vanished. When Polynesians first arrived on Easter Island, they encountered a forest dominated by a giant palm species, the Paschalococos disperta, or Easter Island palm. These weren't small trees. Based on pollen analysis and root casts preserved in lava tubes, they likely grew 60 to 80 feet tall with trunks over 3 feet in diameter. Similar palms still exist in Chile, giving scientists a reference for what once covered Rapa Nui. These palms were everything to the islanders. The trunks provided logs for moving Moai and building canoes for deep-sea fishing. The fronds were used for thatching roofs. The nuts were edible. The trees prevented soil erosion on the volcanic slopes and maintained the island's water cycle. Remove them, and you remove the ecological foundation of the entire island. And remove them they did. Pollen cores taken from the island's crater lakes tell the story. Before human arrival, palm pollen makes up a significant portion of the samples. After settlement, it begins declining. By 1400 AD, it's nearly gone. By 1650, the Easter Island palm was completely extinct. Not rare, not endangered, gone. But it wasn't just the palms used for Moai transport. As the population grew, people needed farmland. The slash-and-burn agriculture that worked sustainably on larger islands became devastating on this tiny, isolated one. Trees were cut down and burned to clear fields for sweet potatoes and other crops. With no large landmasses nearby to resupply seeds or wildlife, there was no recovery. Once a species disappeared from Easter Island, it was gone forever. The rats the settlers brought with them made things worse. Polynesian rats reproduce quickly and eat voraciously. They consumed palm nuts before they could germinate, ensuring no new trees grew to replace the ones being cut down. Archaeological excavations show rat-gnawed palm nuts in the thousands. Even if the islanders had wanted to stop deforestation at some point, the rats had already sealed the tree's fate. The collapse of Rapa Nui civilization. Without trees, everything unraveled. The largest canoes required long, straight tree trunks. Without those, deep-sea fishing became impossible. The islanders' protein intake dropped dramatically. They could still fish in shallow waters and gather shellfish, but it wasn't enough for thousands of people. Archaeological evidence shows a shift in diet. Fish bones and middens become smaller and less common. Chicken bones become more prevalent. Chickens were the only domestic animal that could be raised effectively on the island, and they became increasingly precious. Without trees, soil erosion accelerated. The volcanic soil was rich but loose. Tree roots had held it in place. Once exposed, wind and rain washed it away. Crop yields declined. Streams dried up or became seasonal. The island that had supported thousands began to struggle to feed hundreds. Without wood for moving statues, moai construction ground to a halt. The last statues carved at Rano-Raraku were never erected. They remain there today, scattered around the quarry in various stages of completion. The competition between clans for spiritual power through bigger statues had driven the resource extraction to unsustainable levels. Now, there weren't enough resources to continue the very traditions that defined their culture. Social order collapsed. The archaeological record from this period shows a dramatic increase in weapons, specifically mataa, sharp obsidian spear points. Thousands have been found scattered across the island. Oral traditions speak of the Huri Moai, the statue-toppling time when rival clans destroyed each other's moai. Nearly every statue on the island was eventually pushed over, their faces buried in the dirt. It was cultural warfare, erasing ancestors and spiritual power. Cannibalism appears in the archaeological record during this period, though the extent is debated. Human bones show cut marks consistent with butchering. Whether this was ritual, survival, or both remains uncertain. What's clear is that society fractured into hostile factions, fighting over dwindling resources on an island that could no longer support them. What the soil and bones revealed. Modern scientific techniques have given us an incredibly detailed picture of what happened. Soil analysis shows dramatic changes in composition and erosion patterns corresponding to deforestation. Pollen analysis from sediment cores provides a year-by-year record of vegetation changes. Radiocarbon dating of artifacts, bones, and charcoal gives us precise timelines. Human remains tell a grim story. Skeletal analysis shows nutritional stress increasing over time. Earlier burials show healthy, well-nourished individuals. Later burials show evidence of malnutrition, disease, and violence. Bone chemistry analysis reveals shifts in diet, confirming the move away from marine resources toward terrestrial foods as fishing became more difficult. Archaeological excavations of village sites show changes in house construction. Earlier homes were larger and more permanent. Later structures were smaller, more temporary, and increasingly built in defensible locations like caves or high ground. People were hunkering down, protecting what little they had from their neighbors. The timing of these changes matches the environmental data almost perfectly. As the trees disappeared, the society transformed from a cooperative culture capable of organizing massive construction projects into scattered hostile groups struggling to survive. It wasn't a gradual decline. The collapse happened relatively quickly, over just a few generations. The population crash. Nobody saw coming. By the time Europeans first encountered Easter Island in 1722, the population had crashed. Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen estimated between 2,000 and 3,000 people lived there. The island was mostly barren grassland, dotted with fallen statues. There were no trees taller than 10 feet. The inhabitants lived in caves and stone shelters. They had small, leaky canoes barely suitable for coastal fishing. But the devastation didn't end with ecological collapse. European contact brought new disasters. Ships brought diseases, smallpox, syphilis, and tuberculosis, to which the islanders had no immunity. In 1862, Peruvian slave raiders abducted about 1,500 islanders, roughly half the remaining population, to work in guano mines. Most died in captivity. The few who returned brought smallpox, sparking an epidemic. By 1877, only 111 native Rapa Nui people remained alive. An entire civilization, one that had created some of the most iconic monuments in human history, had been reduced to barely more than 100 survivors. The language nearly disappeared. Cultural knowledge was lost. The techniques for carving and moving moai died with the elders who remembered them. Modern Easter Island has recovered somewhat. The population today is around 8,000, though many are not of native descent. The language has been partially revived. Tourism brings income. But the island remains a warning, a stark example of what happens when a society exhausts its resources faster than they can regenerate. Why this matters for us today. Easter Island isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a case study in ecological collapse, and the parallels to our current global situation are unsettling. A civilization pursued short-term cultural goals, building bigger and more elaborate statues for prestige, without recognizing the long-term environmental costs. By the time they realized the forests wouldn't last forever, it was too late to stop the collapse. The islanders were intelligent people. They weren't ignorant or foolish. They simply couldn't see or chose not to see that their way of life was unsustainable until the consequences became unavoidable. Someone must have noticed the trees disappearing. Someone probably argued for conservation. But the social momentum, the competition between clans, the religious significance of the moai, all of it pushed them forward even as the foundation crumbled beneath them. We face similar pressures today, just on a global scale. Instead of one island's forests, we're depleting ocean fisheries, groundwater reserves, and topsoil. Instead of moai, we're building economies dependent on continuous growth. Instead of isolated clans competing for prestige, we have nations competing for resources and power. The mechanisms are larger and more complex, but the underlying dynamic is eerily similar. Easter Island had no backup. They couldn't import wood from another island or relocate when resources ran out. They were trapped with the consequences of their choices. Earth is the same. There's no other planet to escape to if we exhaust this one. The isolation that made Easter Island vulnerable makes our entire species vulnerable on a planetary scale. The moai still stand on Easter Island, many re-erected by archaeologists. They stare inland with blank eyes, silent witnesses to a civilization that built monuments to its ancestors while destroying the world its descendants would inherit. The mystery of how they were moved has been solved. The real question is whether we'll learn from what happened next.